In May 2009, an Airbus A330 vanished over the Atlantic Ocean. No distress message or other indications of a problem were received by any air traffic control center responsible for that area. Where had the plane gone and what had happened to it? It would be 2 years until the wreckage was found and that investigators were able to shine a light on the events of that night. Today we are going to take a look at the strange case of Air France 447. Welcome to Airspace.
You want clear for takeoff.
On Sunday the 31st of May 2009, an Airbus A330 operated by Air France left Rio de Janeiro headed to Paris Charles de Gaulle. Being just 4 years old, the plane had been one of Air France's newest planes at the time. The flight took off to its 10.5-hour journey just before 11:30 in the evening and headed into the night towards the Atlantic Ocean. It is the first officer this night who is piloting the aircraft. Due to the long flight time, the flight was operated with not 2 but 3 pilots, 1 captain and 2 first officers, one of which would replace the captain during his rest period in the middle of the flight. It might seem strange at first to leave an airliner without a captain in the middle of a flight, but this is a completely normal procedure. One of the first officers must have undergone special training to replace the captain, while the other regular first officer keeps his role. After takeoff, the replacement first officer leaves the cockpit to begin his rest period. The flight is smooth so far, except for some light turbulence. About 3 hours into the flight, the co-pilot adjusts his navigation display to greater range and with its radar detects unfavorable weather ahead. As the aircraft starts to approach it, turbulence gets slightly stronger and the first officer notes that the aircraft is entering the cloud tops. In order to get a better view of the outside world, the crew dims the cockpit lights and switches on the exterior lights. Around 8 minutes later, the turbulence stops and the captain decides that now is a good time to wake up the replacement first officer so that the captain may commence his rest. Now the cockpit is occupied by the replacement first officer and the regular first officer, and the aircraft is flying at flight level 350 or 35,000 feet, which is about 10,700 meters. Around 8 minutes later, the first officers decide to deviate 12 degrees to the left due to some weather ahead. Just 2 minutes later, the autopilot and automatic thrust management computer disconnect, which leaves the aircraft to be manually controlled by the pilots. The regular first officer immediately calls out that he will be the one flying the plane. However, the aircraft begins rolling to the right and the first officer applies control inputs to the left and begins, probably unintentionally, to lift the airplane's nose, just gradually. The first automatic warning calls out stall, stall,
Stalled.
indicating that the angle of attack of the airplane is getting dangerously high and that if the aircraft's nose is lifted further, the wings would no longer provide enough lift for flight. None of the first officers acknowledge this warning. Meanwhile, the assisting co-pilot tries to find out what is causing the trouble by looking at the instruments and the ECAM, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, which is the electronic checklist display in the middle of the instrument panel. The 2 pilots notice right away that something is amiss with their speed indications. In an airliner cockpit, airspeed and various other parameters are displayed at least twice, once to the left on the captain's side and once on the first officer's side. Additionally, there is a small backup instrument that also shows the airspeed. The pilots realize that their 2 displays now show disagreeing data and remark that they have lost the speeds. In the meantime, the flying first officer struggles with the plane, applying ever greater force on the side stick, over-controlling the aircraft. The plane rolls from left to right and pitches up to now 11 degrees, which is more than 3 times the angle required for normal cruise flight. The aircraft is now climbing and rapidly losing airspeed. The assisting first officer notices this and demands several times that his colleague should descend. The latter responded with several nose-down inputs, which slightly reduced the pitch angle of the aircraft. At this time, the aircraft had already climbed 2,000 feet and continued to climb. 29 seconds after trouble began, the airspeed indications began to recover, and after 61 seconds they were completely valid again. This went unnoticed by the first officers. Around this time, they called for the captain via the respective call button several times. Still climbing, the aircraft reached now a maximum altitude of 38,000 feet. Now the first officer reduced the thrust slightly, which led to the aircraft lowering its nose to about 6 degrees, which is still way too high at this altitude. Since the air here is so thin, everything more than maximum 5 degrees will not allow a passenger aircraft's wing to create enough lift for sustained flight. The stall warning now comes on again.
Stalled, stalled.
From now on, this warning sounds continuously for 54 seconds, urging the pilots to regain control of the aircraft. None of the pilots ever acknowledged or acted upon this warning. The first officer now pushes the thrust levers forward again for maximum thrust and commands the airplane's nose to rise even more, which led the aircraft flying with its nose up 16 degrees in the air. Seeing his colleague struggle, the replacement first officer now calls out for the other first officer to relinquish control and takes control of the aircraft himself. However, the other first officer continues to provide input to his controls, which are then added to the command inputs of his colleague, leading to a very confusing situation in which none of the pilots is really properly flying the aircraft. Additionally, now the airspeed readings became invalid again and the stall warning stopped. 1.5 minutes after the beginning of the situation, the captain now enters the cockpit and demands to know what is going on, to which the first officers respond that they were losing control of the plane and that they have tried everything. However, the captain is unable to immediately provide assistance. At this time, the aircraft is now descending, its nose 15 degrees up in the sky, with a descent rate of more than 10,000 feet per minute, about 4 times the maximum of experienced rates of descent in normal everyday flight. The airspeeds suddenly become valid again, and the stall warning continues to sound until impact 2 minutes and 26 seconds later. The rest of the descent is marked by exclamations of confusion among the pilots, and with both pilots simultaneously attempting to control the aircraft in a contradicting and uncoordinated manner. In the last 10 seconds before impact, the aircraft's ground proximity warning system comes on and warns of the impending impact and issues a pull-up warning.
Sink rate. Pull up.
Which in that circumstance was not helpful at all, since it is intended to avoid terrain collisions in flight, not in stall condition. The first officer's final words were, "We're going to crash, this can't be true, but what is happening?" So what happened on this fateful night? It was a mystery for almost 2 years, since that was the time it took to locate the wreckage, submerged almost 4,000 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 10 kilometers away from the aircraft's last recorded position. After the recovery of the plane, its voice and flight recorders were processed, and quickly it was determined that pilot error had caused the accident. Usually, if a situation of unreliable speed indication is detected, and the autopilot shuts off because it can no longer fly the plane since it's missing this crucial data, this calls for the checklist called unreliable speed. This checklist must be known by heart by all Airbus pilots. In the beginning, one must continue to fly the aircraft smoothly, applying a certain amount of thrust and a pitch angle at which the aircraft will fly safely, which may be as high as 5 degrees. Then a table is consulted to determine the exact amount of thrust and pitch needed for sustained flight and for troubleshooting, for example to determine which of the displayed speeds is still valid. Also, once the situation got out of hand and the aircraft entered the stall for the first time, this would have immediately called for the stall recovery checklist, which must also be known by heart by all pilots. At its core, it is the same for every airplane, be it a small Cessna or a mighty airliner. One must lower the plane's nose enough so that it may decrease its angle of attack and produce lift again. One might wonder, how did the airplane's computers know that it was stalling even when the speed probes were blocked by ice? To understand that, one must know that a stall can simply be measured by a vane in an airstream, measuring at which angle the airstream hits the plane. If the angle of this airstream, called the angle of attack, gets too high, the airplane will no longer properly fly. But what led to the loss of the speed indications in the first place? First, we have to look at how speed is measured in an aircraft. For this purpose, a device called a pitot-tube is used. In essence, it is just a tube held in the airstream, measuring how much air is pressed into the tube. The faster a plane flies, the more air is pushed into it at a given time. Since airplanes fly through all kinds of weather phenomena, be it rain, snow, or clouds, all pitot tubes are electrically heated so that they do not freeze over, even at temperatures as low as minus 70 degrees Celsius. However, while Air France 447 flew through a top layer of some convective clouds, it encountered a rare phenomenon that was not completely understood by the aviation community at that time, called ice crystal icing. It was long known that high-altitude clouds consist of very small, frozen water droplets. However, it was unknown that these crystals can cause problems if large ones exist in large quantities. In the case of Air France 447, these crystals entered the pitot tubes and overwhelmed their heating systems, blocking the tubes and invalidating the speed measurements. As the aircraft left the zone of high ice crystal concentrations, the heating of the pitot tubes was once again able to cope with the incoming load of ice, and the speed readings became valid again. Sadly, at this point, the pilots had already lost control of their plane. In the end, this accident, like most others in aviation, was not caused by one single circumstance, but a chain of events that led to a catastrophic end. The French investigative committee BEA released several directives and recommendations after the investigation, most notably to conduct studies to better understand cloud composition at high altitude, and thereafter modify future pitot tubes so that they may cope with ice crystal icing. Also, it recommended that airline pilots must undergo more and better training concerning stalls and manual aircraft handling at high altitude. 216 passengers and 12 crew lost their life that night.